Good morning. This is Senator Black, Focus on the News. We're at Monday, May the 22nd, and we are going to be discussing a very, very important topic this morning. The title of our edition is Russia Wins the Epic Battle for Bakhmut. We have our guests, Diane Sare from New York, very politically active in the race for U.S. Senate recently. We have Jim Jatras, a tremendous Russian expert from his days back in the United States Senate as a key member of the staff there. So let's just start in this. Jim, can you give us your initial thoughts of exactly what is happening on the ground over there today?
Well, the best we can tell is that the Russians have finally consolidated their hold over Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk, as they call it. And I think a lot of people misunderstand what this battle was about. For the Ukrainians, it was always, like the rest of their strategy on this war, a propaganda thing, that they have to hold Bakhmut at all costs. Not to say that Bakhmut is not strategically important, because it is. It was the keystone of the Ukrainians' defense line in eastern Ukraine. It's also a major rail and road juncture that the Ukrainians really needed to take hold of. And that's why there's been a lot of propaganda over the months that the Russians were making slow going, that they weren't really moving fast, that they were encountering difficulties, that they were taking on great losses. None of that stuff is true, because for the Russians, it wasn't really about seizing Bakhmut, or at least not doing so on a quick basis, but rather creating a situation where the Ukrainians had to stand and fight for it, which means funneling more and more men and materiel into Bakhmut that they could ill afford to use, for the Russians then to destroy them. And that's what's been happening over the last 9 or 10 months. And it's really a terrible tragedy on human terms. I mean, if you look at some of these videos of just the cemeteries in Ukraine filling up with soldiers' graves, it's just obscene, the way the Kiev regime and their Western supporters have been willing to make Bakhmut a kind of a Stalingrad, in, I guess maybe in reverse, that they've been just destroying all these people for something that clearly they were never going to win. When you look at the rates of fire, the degree of to which the Russians have much more artillery and other munitions compared to the Ukrainians. So now it's finally happened. And the question now is, what happens next? Do the Ukrainians finally get around to launching their much talked about offensive? And what happens after that if they do manage to do that? Or do the Russians make their next move that many people, not the Russians themselves, but other people have been saying that the Russians will make some sort of now major offensive of their own, the direction of which we can guess about, but we can't really be sure of.
Well, Diane, the media is right now trying to grapple with the fact that the biggest battle of the Ukraine war has been lost by Ukraine, has been won by the Russians, an epic battle of enormous proportions. And but we see sort of confusion. You see the mainstream media bumping into one another, trying to come up with explanations for what's going on and so forth. What do you envision of some of the fallout within the media and within the greater political context on all of this?
Well, I'm not sure how it's going to shape up. It reminds, I mean, it's very similar to what just happened with the Patriot missile battery that was just taken out by the Russians. We hear this one story from Ukraine about how they supposedly shot down 6 Kinzhal missiles. But the truth of the matter is that Russia exploded a major weapons depot. It looks like the one containing the depleted uranium that the British sent over there. and took out this Patriot system. I heard an interview with Scott Ritter yesterday where he was saying that these Patriot systems are very, very hard to use. And from the fact that they just sent 30 missiles up immediately all at once made him think that it was on the default setting. And therefore, they just blew everything all at once. They revealed where they were because of a Russian drone flying over. You know, I think part of the problem, we're in the fog of war. So we know certain things. We know that the Ukrainians tend to lie about everything. We know the Russians tend to be more accurate, and if they don't want to discuss something or took a loss or made a mistake, you just get silence. And then you have to figure it out. And I think it's useful always to take a step back and consider how we got into this mess. And I must say, if Shakespeare were alive today, the fact that you have the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, where we used a nuclear bomb completely unnecessarily when Japan was prepared to surrender, and the terms of surrender were already being worked out, and the horrible devastation and destruction, and moving the world into what Bertrand Russell and others envisioned, these globalists, where you control everything based on the fear of nuclear war, which was the point of preemptively using nuclear weapons. So here you have the G7 leaders. It should have been G8. They expelled Russia earlier, having a meeting, and then Zelensky comes in to address them. I mean, it just seems like some wild drama unfolding, and we don't know. Is it going to end in a tragedy? Is it a comedy? Is it a tragedy? I think the jury is still out on that, and I think we have obviously an enormous job to do in the United States to cut through the lying, and I think your contribution to that, Senator, is extremely important.
Thank you very much, Diane. You mentioned the Patriot missile system. It seems like throughout the war, the part of the rhetoric has been that if we spend enough money, if we send some new whiz-bang weapon, it's going to change everything. It's going to shift the tide of battle. But in looking at it, there's no doubt that weapons have been important. The HIMARS, sort of the rocket-assisted artillery, was very helpful to the Ukrainians. But the Russians have figured out now to counter it. It's made it relatively ineffective today. Jim, what is your impression of the impact of all of the new weapon systems that have been integrated over there?
As far as I can tell, each of one of these new Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons that were supposed to be game changers have never really been game changers. To take the Patriot, for example, Diane mentioned sending a drone over and then the Patriot firing missiles so it would pinpoint its location. The other thing it did is, as I understand it, in about 2 minutes, they expended approximately a fifth of the yearly production of all of those missiles available for the Patriot system. I mean, we just don't have the industrial capacity to produce these things faster. So even if you have a perfectly functional weapon system and all the missiles for it have been expended, what good is it? So that's the kind of dilemma we're finding ourselves with now. As you point out, Senator, yes, the Russians have found ways to counteract these systems, and plus the systems, however they're functioning and however the Russians are contending with them, are being depleted at a rate that is simply not sustainable at the pace of combat in which this war is proceeding. And then you also have the problem, we hear all the talk now, we're going to provide F-16s, and maybe after F-16s, we're going to provide some other aircraft. Nobody really seems to ask the question, where are these aircraft going to be based? If they're based in Ukraine, the Russians will hit the bases, they will kill the ground crew, they will destroy the maintenance facilities for these things. But on the other hand, if they're going to be based outside of Ukraine, where? In Poland, in Romania, we're going to be flying missions from NATO countries where obviously the Russians will consider those targets and will be directly involved in combat.
Yeah, ever since we started this business of adding additional aggressive weapons, we have just sort of ratcheted up the risk of something triggering a NATO-Russia conflict, and in so doing, potentially causing somebody to say, well, look, we're losing this war, NATO. We got to use tactical nuclear weapons. And I think there's a general consensus that would lead to a nuclear war. Now, Diane, I may be a little behind the times. I'm not sure, but it's my understanding that there were only 2 of these Patriot missile systems in Ukraine, and 1 has been knocked out. Are you aware of any more than 2 being there?
No, that's what I understand is the case. I mean, I think partly what we're really dealing with is this question of nemesis and the question of how the West will respond. Is there going to be a Zeus complex where, Götterdämmerung, right? After, if I can't run the world, I'll just destroy it and everything in it, including myself. And that's it, a total nihilistic, horrendous approach. Are these people who are making these policies so delusional that they imagine they can survive a nuclear war? And I'm afraid there is some of that. They're extremely arrogant. But the world is really changing, and it's very hard for Americans to have a sense of it because our media is so controlled. But if you think about, for example, what China did with its getting talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then Syria getting readmitted into the Arab League and the implications of that, and then you think of Zelensky appearing at the Arab League and lecturing them on how they're turning a blind eye to what it's like to have your country occupied. I mean, if that is not one of the richest ironies, at the town hall meeting I had with Janice Courtcamp, she said, and I don't know, maybe you can tell me if this is the case or not, but at least I'm sure it's comparable. The amount of Syria, the land area in Syria occupied by the United States is comparable, maybe greater, I don't know, than what Russia now controls in Ukraine. I mean, so somehow this idea that the world doesn't see what is under their nose, that people who have been, can you imagine lecturing Assad, lecturing Syria on why they're not being sympathetic enough to the occupation of Ukraine by a foreign power? And that's what I'm saying, this kind of delusion. People are on drugs, or I don't know what's the matter with them. And I think there's a principle of natural law, which is why in the end, the person or group that asserts a principle of justice will prevail. Now, God is not irrational, so you have to have a certain critical mass. It doesn't mean that you will win, get nirvana, if you cannot move enough people based on a principle of justice. But it does mean that those people committed to evil, committed to a total violation of everything that is true and real, will not be able to succeed. So I think we're in one of the most incredible moments in human history. And again, I think the people of the United States really have to find our identity. I think we have to look back to what John Quincy Adams said. I think we have to remember that we won a revolution against the British Empire. We're coming up very rapidly on the 60-year anniversary of that amazing speech that President Kennedy gave at American University just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he called for peace. And he said, not peace in our time, I'm talking about peace for all time. I find communism repugnant, but that doesn't mean the Soviet Union didn't lose over 20 million lives fighting alongside us, the fascism in Europe. And he said, we can't forget that. We can't forget their contributions to science. We have to commit ourselves to finding a pathway out of this that is above, the traditional way of doing things, that is above revenge, that's worthy of mankind. So somehow I think we've got to get ourselves into that domain, because here on the ground and in the kinetic battle, it's extremely dangerous. And I'm afraid we are dealing with severe irrationality and delusions of grandeur in the West, which could unleash an absolute horror.
Well, I do believe that the comparison with Syria is very, very apt, because the United States conducted an illicit invasion of Syria. The Syrian armed forces, after having been pushed back for years, began to surge forward, began to recapture the entirety of the country, and the United States desperately implemented their plan B, which was to seize the part of Syria that produced all of its wheat and most of its oil, and thereby to create famine and to starve the country. And so the idea that somehow there's some inviolability of national borders, for the United States to be making that claim is rather obscene, because we have violated national borders with impunity for generations now. We invaded Libya with absolutely no provocation, and as Jim is aware, we invaded Serbia on the side of Islamic terrorists, which seems to often be the case. We have this war on terror, but it seems to be more a war on Christianity. But I am interested, Jim. You have served in the halls of Congress as a fairly influential member of the Senate staff. As the impact of this defeat gradually filters out of the news, and the magnitude of the defeat and the tremendous losses on both sides, but certainly on the side of the Ukrainians, where they have much more difficulty replacing their losses than the Russians. Do you envision perhaps some shift in the attitude within the U.S. Congress on continuing this flood of money, printing money that we don't have to send over and defend the borders of Ukraine, while we leave our own borders wide open and in a state of collapse? Do you see a potential for some change in congressional attitudes?
I can see the potential for some infighting and for some Republican cheap efforts to make political partisan points against the Biden administration in anticipation of next year's election. I'm not sure it will go beyond that. I don't know. Maybe Bakhmut will turn out to be the horseshoe nail that brings down the whole thing. You know, for the want of the nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of the shoe, the horse was lost, etc. Because it probably is dawning on a lot of people that Bakhmut, if it becomes the beginning of the unraveling of the Ukrainian war effort, that Ukraine is clearly going to lose, which means then, of course, NATO and the global American empire, the GAY, as I call it, is also going to lose. And we see more and more countries around the world drifting into the Eurasian camp, the Shanghai Security Organization, the BRICS, and so forth, the BRICS Bank, that it becomes clear even to the stupidest people that the whole edifice of U.S. Centered power around the world, the whole transatlantic empire that has sought since the end of the first Cold War to become the global hegemon, that's not going to happen, that it's going to come crashing down one way or another. And by the way, that's going to have tremendous consequences for us here back in the United States in terms of when, you know, the dollar, for example, is no longer the world's reserve currency and so forth. Can people in the political apparatus come to grips with that? And I think the short answer is no, they cannot. No more than the Soviet Communist Party could come to grips with the failure of their system in the 1980s. That there were simply changes that simply could not be accommodated by a system that had become so ossified, so sclerotic, it was incapable of changing course. And I'm afraid that's what we're facing here in the United States, that rather than some kind of a deliberative, well thought out shift in our national policy, what we're going to see instead is some kind of a break, some sort of a crack, maybe some sort of a collapse, the specifics of which we can't really anticipate, but it's not going to be pretty.
If I may say something, because I really think you're right. And as Senator Black said, I just ran for U.S. Senate against Schumer. I'm now running against Kirsten Gillibrand for U.S. Senate in New York, and I follow what goes on in the Congress rather closely. And I am astounded by this political posturing on a very low level, frankly. You have Seymour Hersh giving the whole Congress this gift. If you wanted to stop Biden, Nord Stream, it was blown up. It's the biggest act of infrastructure terrorism ever. Seymour Hersh is not a lightweight. If you wanted to follow that up, if you wanted to do the investigation, you could have Biden, Blinken, Victoria Nuland, Jake Sullivan, the whole crew could be brought up on criminal charges and out of there. And instead, what you get is articles of impeachment because of the border, the money, investigations about getting money from foreigners. In other words, they're sort of diversionary and people want to be popular and they're thinking about the election. They're not actually thinking, how do we change the course of history? How do we take something as egregious as this, which is huge, lay our stake, here and say, we're taking back the United States. We're not going to allow our government these kind of crimes to be committed in our name. And another example I want to bring up, we just had the Durham report. And the Durham report, frankly, is very mild and you could say is somewhat of a cover-up. But I was telling you, Senator Black, earlier, and I found this quote, which is unbelievable, in the summary conclusion on page 17 of the report. And they say, Durham says, based on the review of Crossfire Hurricane and related intelligence activities, we conclude that the department and the FBI failed to uphold their important mission of strict fidelity to the law in connection with certain events and activities described in this report. Senator Black, you have a legal background. Tell us, what does this mean?
Well, Mr. Durham is hardly an aggressive prosecutor. It is just amazing. Anyone who thinks that the FBI has been devoted to upholding the rule of law does not know the FBI. members of the FBI are coming out publicly saying that the FBI is not upholding the rule of law. And, you know, the FBI was deeply complicit in the entire effort to concoct this Russia hoax, which was grounded on a political smear piece that was funded by the Hillary Clinton campaign, and so it was a highly partisan effort to distort and overthrow the true results of the presidential election of 2026, or 2016 rather, and so the FBI is scarcely a model of legal integrity and decorum. But I do wonder whether I wonder whether in Europe, you know, you mentioned the Nord Stream 2, the American sabotage of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, not actually Nord Stream 1 and 2, where the US blew up one of the most important industrial pieces of capital investment that have existed. The two pipelines, actually there were three pipelines, Nord Stream 2 consisted of two, and when the US blew those up, we essentially severed the lifeblood that has ensured prosperity for Europe now for generations and given them a strong, stable economy. We just destroyed it, which was clearly an act of war against Germany, as well as an act of war against Russia. And at that point, the European countries had become such vassal states that they simply put a zipper over their mouths, hunkered their heads down, kept their eyes on the ground, and didn't say anything. But at the same time, the word has slipped out to the people of Europe that yes, it was the United States that destroyed this great German engineering feat, German and Russian and some other countries, and that we have dealt a major permanent blow to the economy of Germany. And now I think as you look, and the people of Europe being much closer to the situation will start to think, okay, we've been promised that Russia was going to be driven back, and perhaps there'd be a possibility of dismantling Russia, disassembling it into a group of many states, taking all of their wealth. Now that's starting to look pretty remote. Russia is dominant. Russia has been victorious. And I just wonder whether Europe is likely to start experiencing some shift of opinion. Jim, you've got a lot of contacts over there. What are your thoughts there? Are they going to continue simply towing the American line, or do you think there may be some restlessness as a result of this?
I think there's restlessness, but the question is, how does it find political expression? It's the same kind of failure of institutions that we talk about here in the United States, that even in a case of a parliamentary system where a new party can break into the system and even achieve power, like we saw in Italy with Giorgia Meloni, a lot of people are beginning to suspect, well, maybe she's controlled opposition because she's certainly still staying on the reservation when it comes to questions like Ukraine, although she may depart from that on some other issues. It's hard to see, given the kind of human materials you have in leadership in all the European countries, with people like Macron and Scholz and Ursula von der Leyen and people like this, that they're not going to change course. And then you say, how does somebody get in who will think fundamentally differently and have the power to turn things around? I mean, let's look even when Trump was elected in 2016 with some ideas that clearly departed from the established narrative. What could he actually do about it? He was basically hemmed in not only by Russiagate and by the Democrats, but by his own party and his own appointees, for crying out loud, to basically not really change the course of anything. After all this buildup in Ukraine to turn into this NATO base directed against Russia and against the people of the Donbass, that took place mostly under the Trump administration. It started under Obama, but it really continued under Trump. And so, the prospect for changing course with a kind of a gatekeeper structure in all of these countries that prevents anybody new, like say Diane becoming in the U.S. Senate instead of those ridiculous people like Schumer and Gillibrand. It's just not. It's not. I find it hard to be optimistic. It seems to me that something fundamental has to break down first before we even have a chance of seeing a significant change in the direction of not only the U.S. but the countries in Europe. As you say, Senator, these people are just obedient vassals. They put their eyes down to the ground. By the way, where are all these green people in the European governments and the American government who care so much about climate change and about greenhouse gases? This is the biggest emission of so-called greenhouse gases in the history of the galaxy, and they don't give a damn about it.
This is true. Well, listen, we're going to wrap it up at this point. I appreciate both of you being with us. We will see where this leads. We know at this point, Western media is very hesitant to acknowledge, and they're trying to come up with the latest spin on it. But in any event, as Diane has mentioned, the Russians tend to be very conservative in their announcements. And we do know that May the 20th, President Vladimir Putin congratulated Russia's troops and the Wagner troops on the capture of the city. I think that is sort of the official word. We will have to await to see what the fallout will be. But in any event, we will continue to track this. Thank you very much for Diane and Diane Sare and Jim Jatras being with us today. This is Dick Black with Focus on the News. We will see you next Monday.